many reforms. Some of them large, some of them small. And now, after the approval of all of them, we're going to now start implementation, the final design. Those are very important, from the instrument reform, knowledge reform, development effectiveness reform, people and diversity reform, things that we believe that we need to change and to do more. That's one transformation, consensus, everybody on board. Number two, a capitalization of IDB Invest. $3.5 billion in a moment where we don't have excess money in the world. $3.5 billion that will double the capital of IDB Invest, double the size of the lending of IDB Invest with a new model, which is originated to share, and other models for IDB Invest. The third one, IDB Lab, is our innovation. We are going to have $100 million with management. We're talking here about grants. That was also anonymously very important. A new model, more sustainable model, talking about innovation hubs. So that's also very new. So 3 very new changes, very difficult ones in terms of consensus. And it took us a year and a lot of work to get a consensus, but we got them in Punta Cana. And that's, I think, is very important. It's important not to the IDP, but I think it's important to the region. We need an IDP renewed, an IDP with more impact, an IDP with more scale, if we're going to help the region. And here brings me to the region and where we are here, which is the macroeconomic report. What is happening in the region? We usually start with the difficulties. So we are in a world, a fragmented, a world where we're having less trade, not more than trade. We're talking about different sides and polarization globally, but also in the country. So this is the world we're facing. So trying to find bridges, trying to find consensus is very important. It's one part of our role. But this reality means that it has to be also part of the reality that we all face before even the fragmentation. The social demands of the region still have a lot of gaps. We are seeing the society impatient. They go to the streets, they change the governments. Every month we have something in some country, political. This is the impatience with the large poverty, inequality, and other social. There are not enough resources to fulfill everything that needs to be done. That's the fiscal constraint. And we are not creating the resources for decades. Productivity growth has been zero. So you don't create resources, you don't have enough resources, and the demands are increasing. In a world where climate change is there, and we are getting people affected by climate change all the time. So for a better world, climate change, people challenge, this is where we are. But I think we need to see where we are also has an opportunity. And from the beginning, and I think this macroeconomic report also looks at it, that we need to see what we are facing, not only as increasing challenges, but also an opportunity. And I think some of the global challenges that we are facing actually could be used as an opportunity. For the first time ever, I believe that the world needs Latin America and the Caribbean as much as the Caribbean and Latin America needs the world. If you want to have an energy transition in time, there's no way you can not have Latin America and American. This is where the initial conditions of clean energy and renewable are more advanced. So you need the region if you're going to get in on time before the tipping point. This is the region that has the Amazon and other biomes. If you really care about diversity and conservation nature, and you want the CO2 emissions there, so whatever we do at the IDP with our Amazon Forever program is not only important for the 8 countries, but this is a global challenge and the world needs it. And that's the reason we are getting so much feedback and so good reaction to the Amazon forever. Not because we did it perfectly, but this is where people want, the world needs. And finally, when we are looking at minerals and others, it's also something that we can use the initial conditions of the region. So we talk about had a project of lithium in Argentina and others. Those are the right minerals. Food security, Ukraine war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Prices go up, food insecurity is everywhere. Where is the 40% trade in food in the world, in the region? So this is an opportunity. Another opportunity, fragmentation. We are not going to work for fragmentation, we're going to work for non-fragmentation. But given the fragmentation, it could be the case that regional integration is also an opportunity. Data, last 2 years, getting a little bit more growth than expected. Our last report had a growth perspective, it's larger, so it was better than expected. It's not coming from, it's coming actually from the larger countries, Brazil, Mexico. Is Mexico starting to benefit from the fragmentation? Maybe. Is Brazil starting to benefit from the climate change and the investments on that? We don't know, it's still very few data, but maybe it's an opportunity. From the IDB point of view, we need to work with that. We need to work with opportunities. So how can we help the region seize a possible opportunity? And part of what the report does is look at what we need to do. I tend to group it into, one is, if this new global context is an opportunity, how can we attract investment? How we can plan it in a way that we get the best out of this period? Maybe we are again we had a commodity boom, it lasted from 2003 to 2013, then it was over. Nothing happened with productivity, we're back to square zero productivity. Can we change it? Can this time around we get more investments, more the way to do it? How do we do it? Things that we do here in terms of policy, regulation, rule of law, the conditions to get the resources and actually to have it over here. That's number one. Number two, productivity growth. I know talking about long-term human capital and skills is long-term, we need to do it. Informality, formality. And I'm not going to argue because this is the role of the panel, but this is the two. The way that we give the conditions to attract more investments so that we take advantage of the opportunities that the global context is giving us. That's number one. And then once they're there, productivity. Because another 5-year boom or 10-year boom with no productivity is not what we want. So those are the two big buckets that I think we can work, and I think the report here has been touching on this area, and I will let the specialists here help us. So let me just conclude to thank you all. First of all, to Eric Parado, our chief economist, for all the effort. And to Galindo and Alejandro Izquierdo, thank you very much. And especially to our panel, Ana Corbacho, thank you very much. I know Marcela Eslava. She's, well, hello. And Liliana Rojas Suarez, thank you. Where is Liliana? Okay. So, thank you for participating. So this is a really hybrid moment. So, thank you very much. Have a nice panel.
Gracias, señor presidente. Recibimos al economista jefe.
Thank you so much. This is the Chief Economist, Eric Parrado, from our research department. Thank you very much. Good day, one and all. And thank you so much for being present here. And we welcome the hundreds of persons who have connected to this call in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you for trying to find out a little bit more about our macroeconomic report. Thank you so much to President Goldstein for his welcome words, where he has pointed out three main transformations. One is institutional, a new business model, and these changes, these strategic changes, are perfectly in agreement with the support to the inflection point that we see in the macroeconomic report, precisely to be able to support these transformations. Before we continue, let me tell you that this macroeconomic report is an effort made by many economists, not only by those from the research department, but also from the social sector, the fiscal department, and many other economists in the vice presidency for countries. My thanks to all of them, and my thanks to our editors, Galindo and Izquierdo, for their effort. It is not easy to prepare a macroeconomic report, and we have had past experiences. There is always a shock at the beginning of the year, and we always end up with two macroeconomic reports. This time it did not happen. So the effort was one sole effort. First of all, I would talk about the front page. For those who were unable to understand it, the idea is that we are about to take off. But after a flight full of turbulence because of the COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, but the landing, as President Goldstein said, was quite soft in 2023. We were expecting a 1% growth, but we had a 2% growth. It's a small rate of growth, but it's better than what we were expecting. And today, the crew is preparing because we see a promising horizon. That is why we see a sun depicted at our destination. But in order to attain it, we need to do things well. That means macroeconomic stability, which we somehow have it in the region, but it also means that we need to have a crew that knows how to fly in that direction to reach this promising horizon. But we need consensus to achieve it. And that is what we are discussing in the report. First of all, I will take some ideas from the president's speech. First of all, the macro stability is very important. On the fiscal aspect, we have done things well, and we have to recognize when we do things well, because the primary deficit today is almost balanced. Obviously, we do have challenges for the total deficit. It is approximately 2.8% of GDP. And this is due because the interest load in our countries is very high. It's over 10% of fiscal income. If we consider it with the rest of the world, they usually pay about 5%. So the difference is not only explained by the risk factor, but also because of a poor management of debt. This is why we need to plan and continue efforts to consolidate the fiscal situation. Today, the debt is about 50% of the GDP. We have to lower the level of debt to more prudent levels. Today, in the monetary aspect, we have done things well. Central banks acted firmly. They increased interest rates much sooner than the banks of the developed world. If we take the greatest difference between the rates of the central banks of Latin America and the Caribbean compared to the developed world, there were 700 percentage points at the peak. That was enormous difference. Then the central banks increased the interest rates, but due to the fact that the region took action very quickly and very well, we see that the inflation rates are coming down to their target. And this was achieved, and we have already talked about this internally. It was due to the independence of central banks, even because of the coordination between monetary and fiscal policies. And the inflation expectations are anchored. The question is, what will we do later? And I imagine that Arturo and Alejandro are going to talk about it, because we do not want to generate such large differences, because we do not want an outflow of capital, and we do not want anything that will push inflation upwards. So this is what we need to think about from now onwards. And the third good piece of news is that today financial systems, especially banking systems, have been part of the solution and not part of the problem, as it was the case in the past. And this is fundamental. In the macro report, we analyze this and we compare how the supervision, banking supervision and financial supervision has evolved, and we see that the effort that was carried out is important, because many countries are today implementing much solid banking system and more liquid ones. And this obviously provides a financial stability that pushes us to stabilize our growth. But macroeconomic stability is not enough. It is necessary, but it is not sufficient. And as President Goldfein said, today we have a structural problem, which is to increase productivity. In the long term, the increase in productivity brings 0% to the member countries. It is not beneficial. There is capital and work that are beneficial, but not the productivity. Today, we need to invest a lot more in the amount of education and the quality of education, and this is what is shown by the latest PISA tests. On the capital point of view, we also estimated something, and we saw that capital is poorly allocated, where resources are allotted to enterprises that are not productive. So we have to make a much greater effort. The estimate that we have is that if we were more efficient in capital allocation, the per capita income could increase by 50%. You heard me well, 50%. And that is the effort that we have to carry out today. In addition to that, in the macro report, we also analyze the competency of our markets, not only as far as the competency in the goods market, but also in capital markets. And we have to go from today's balance and go to a more competitive balance. And this will have repercussions in the increase in productivity. And we need to make an effort to achieve this. In sum, macroeconomic stability is a necessary condition, but it is not sufficient. And in order to reach this promising horizon where the sun is waiting for us, like in Punta Cana, we will need to make the necessary reforms and reach consensus in order to implement these reforms that will have give us the opportunity. And the IDB is here precisely for that. I will not go on. I would like to give the editors of the macro report the floor to talk about the diagnosis and the policies that we are recommending. Arturo and Alejandro, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you today and to share some key ideas and some details to flesh out what Eric and the President have already previewed based on this report. We had the pleasure to coordinate this project this year with Alejandro. But again, behind this, there are a whole lot of people from all of the bank's offices, and they've helped us tremendously do this and prepare the report we are presenting. And in today's presentation, we're going to look at some key topics in the report, beginning by the macroeconomic outlook for the region, in order to then discuss some risk scenarios as well as opportunities. We will then talk about the macroeconomic policy challenges for the short term. And finally, we'll look at some more structural, in-depth issues that have to do with capital accumulation and productivity growth in the region. A good starting point is what happened in the region in 2023. And I would like to thank several colleagues, Leandro Andriani and team, Camila Rivas, Mrs. Celis, a whole lot of people from different offices who helped a lot. In 2023, growth in the region as a whole near 2.1%. We don't yet have all figures, but it's in that region. And this was close to 1 percentage point higher than expected at the beginning of the year. So it was a great surprise to see this growth. Behavior was rather heterogeneous across the region. Here we can see aggregate figures. Perhaps we can look at a medium-sized average country, but there are significant differences across countries. Brazil and Mexico, as the president pointed out, probably are the ones that mostly contributed to the pleasant surprise, but also other countries in the Caribbean and in Central America presented these growth surprises as well. Other regions and other countries in the region showed a surprise that somehow went in the opposite direction. Several Andean countries and countries in the southern cone that suffered major climate shocks. In the Andean countries, there was El Nino. In some southern cone countries, there were major droughts, which also affected the region much more than expected. And we also discuss these issues in greater depth in the report. So what is the outlook for 2024? For 2024, we expect quite similar behavior to that of 2023, with a slight deceleration in growth in the region. Markets are predicting that the region's growth may be close to 1.6%, not too far from what we saw last year. And here again, we see much heterogeneity across the countries in the region. And closer to 2025, it is expected that growth will converge towards 2%, which is a low figure for the long term. And this is something the president noted, considering the needs of the population in the LAC region. Now, what's behind this, the surprise and the slight slowdown in growth? What accounts for this? Well, to a great extent, the global economy's behavior determined the pattern we saw in 2023, in particular, US economy growth. In early 2023, it was expected that growth in the US economy would be close to 6. You may recall about a year ago, we were discussing whether there would be a recession or not in the United States, and the country ended up growing around 2.5%, which was good news for the region and helps explain much of the positive surprise. It also partly explains why a slowdown is expected in the region in 2024. The market is currently predicting that the United States will grow a little less than 2%, depending on what you look at, some 0.2, 1.8 in that region. And although slight improvement is expected in Europe, a slowdown or deceleration is expected in the Chinese economy going forward. And how will this play out over the course of the year? That's important in order to ascertain what the region will look like in late 2024. Anyway, the behavior of other key international variables will be vital for the region. One of them is the global cost of financing, and on the other hand, the prices of commodities, as the region is an important exporter of many of those products. On the first point, it should be noted that the cost of sovereign finance for our region's countries has gone up by over 300 basic points. And unlike in the past, the increase in the cost of finance is not due to an increased risk perception in the region, but rather this is due to an increase in the base rate, as the graph shows, with the evolution of the U.S. Treasury bonds over 10 years. This has had to do with the increase in the short-term bonds and also has had to do with changes in the risk prospects as far as the United States is concerned, and also changes in demand, both private and public sectors, in connection with these securities. And Alejandro will also refer to the consequences of these values remaining high, as this has an impact on the fiscal and monetary policies of our countries. Commodity prices, on the other hand, remain high compared to the pre-pandemic period, and the futures markets for several commodities suggest that at least for this year, they will remain at somewhat high levels. Anyway, it should be noted that any of these things will affect the different countries in the region differently. Now, since the COVID shock, economies have recovered, and that has helped preserve a decreasing trend in terms of poverty and inequality in the region. Somehow, the 2023 surprise is positive in terms of reinforcing the trend. But again, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the region. And of course, some of you are well aware of the situation in certain countries, and you can also see the heterogeneity. The report has included several exercises, including scenarios we look at regarding what happens to the region's economies in different global shock scenarios. I won't dwell on this, but one important point to stress as part of the current discussion has to do with global interest rates. You will see that in our report, we look at shocks to US economic growth or Chinese economic growth, and also commodity price shocks. And then there's the shock relating to interest rates. And our models assume that the monetary policy rate in the United States would start to go down in the second half of the year, which is consistent with market expectations at the moment. And we could be looking at a fall in 100 basic points. It could perhaps be a little less, some 75, but this simulation exercise, what we assume in the report or look at in the report, is what happens if the interest rates fail to come down and they remain high, at least for the rest of 2024. And what we can see is that this could involve a cost of at least half a point in terms of growth for the countries in the LAC region. So it is no minor matter. And again, this ties in with the Fed discussions. Extending the high rates is obviously not a minor issue for the region, and Alejandro will soon be talking about that too. Now, the key point to these exercises, and to give an idea of magnitude, and also it's interesting to see how potential external shocks impact the region. And again, interest rates is interesting to note since it's all over the news. The president also referred to opportunities, and just as we have risks, we also have opportunities, clearly. And I will not repeat what the president has already stated, but when we look at climate change, there are substantial opportunities also in terms of food security and the clean energy transition. And also if we look at geographical shifts in the global value chains, and all of these things we discuss in detail in the report. And the key point we want to convey is that although all of these opportunities are there, as a region, we need to think about what it is we're going to do to be able to harness them, because that is precisely what can help us stay away from these long-term static levels of 2%. So I would like to now give the floor to Alejandro to expand a bit. Thank you. Thank you. I'm very pleased to present the macro report once again this year. I would first like to thank many of the co-authors of this report. It would be impossible to acknowledge each and every one of them, but I see several of you here. Also, as far as the monetary part is concerned. So thanks to you all. So, as Arturo said, we have opportunities. We've done well on the macro stability front, but we shouldn't rest on our laurels. This morning, I saw an article with a funny saying in Spanish that says that a crocodile that falls asleep ends up as a handbag. I think it's quite interesting to illustrate the situation of the region. When you look at the primary balance sheets, as Eric said, we have 4 percentage points of GDP by way of deficit, and of course, we were able to take this to zero. In previous crises, such as in 2008, we tried to pursue counter-cyclical policies, but we ended up expansionary by way of transfers and so on. So it was very difficult to undo all that. But this time it didn't happen in the same way. That's good news. Now, the other thing we need to deal with is the fact that the increase in global interest rates mean that countries still face financial deficits that are considerable, 2.8 on average. And to this is added the fact that if we're going to carry out the transformations that are needed to grow more, we need to create fiscal space. So the fiscal effort is important. Now, how do we manage this in order not to have excessive increases in spending, or the effects in terms of ordinary capital, so the classics for the region? So that's one question. Now, although there is uncertainty, the markets have recognized the work done to reduce expenditure, and we can see this reflected in the decrease in the credit default swaps. So the risk perceived by the market is going down. That's the good news. Now, in order to deal with the short-term issues faced by the countries in the region, and also to deal with the structural issues, after all, it's public spending that loses out in these processes. So we are very much for putting in place useful fiscal rules, and not just any old fiscal rule. We think the graph on the left shows, interestingly, that if you compare countries with rules as opposed to those who don't, those with rules have an increase in debt proportionally compared to those who don't have the rules. And we were wondering, and when you start checking for quality rules, then you can see that when you have a solid legal foundation, when you have flexible rules that help you adapt to shocks, when you have rules that make sure that there are compliance standards, that's when things improve. And the right-hand graph shows how there is a systematic fall in the increase of debt relative to GDP, or also the volatility levels go down. So when there are good fiscal rules, things start looking up. Another thing about fiscal rules that we encourage is also setting limits on public spending. Even our best students, Chile and Colombia, who followed the fiscal rules to the letter, ended up with higher debt levels. This was because there were loopholes and leaks that always ended up leading to these results. So setting limits on debt is useful. And it's not just about having debt limits, but also having prudential debt values, so that when you're getting a bit too close to the limit, this triggers mechanisms for greater savings in primary surplus, so that you never actually touch the limit. And if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, it's interesting to see how having good fiscal rules saves you 4 percentage points of GDP in terms of debt. And if you add the prudential element, it's even better. So 8 points of debt available there if you have good rules. And then there's compliance, of course. When dealing with policies, we talk about compliance, but those who do follow the rules have advantages. If you look at the right-hand graph and the last column, it shows the difference between the EMBI spreads paid by countries according to whether they are good compliers or non-compliers. That's also interesting to note. And the third element I think is useful in good fiscal rules has to do with protecting public investment. As we've been saying for some years, systematically, public investment has been losing weight in budgets because, we tend to bring up current spending when things are looking good, and the opposite when things are not so good. We've done several studies over the years. Let me give you quite a telling example based on our estimates. When you actually look at what countries protect public investment by putting limits on current spending for it not to run away, the public capital stock you end up with are a lot higher. So that's important. And the other thing, especially now, if we have to go into a consolidation phase, work we've done at the IDB also shows that public investment has a much higher component relative to current spending. And the right-hand graph shows that there is no recessionary effect through adjustment and that things can go expansionary if you pursue the right policy. So what should public investment policies consider is something you can read in the report, but of course good rules are key. And another important thing is that fiscal councils should play a more significant role since they are those who oversee what government does, and they should be given more budget, and they should also be allowed to take part more actively in forecasts. And if they are also given a chance to intervene, to be a party to the process, that's important. And of course, you need to pursue efficiency gains as far as spending is concerned. And then public sector salaries, public procurement, and subsidy targeting will prove very important. Something obviously easier said than done is making VAT more progressive. And this year in particular, given the OECD agreement and global taxes will be levied on businesses regardless of where they are. This is something we should take advantage for companies to stay in our regions. So now on the monetary front, some good news is that inflation has been easing across the region. It went from 10 to 3% if you look at the median. So central banks have been successful, as Eric noted, and the president too. So this is good. We are already entering the inflation targets range, so that's quite good. And we were among the first to introduce the interest rate increases, and now we are the first to start undoing that, which is useful. But of course, we will be starting with much higher rate levels, and therein lies a challenge. So now the question we get to ask ourselves is how to manage the soft landing. How do we go about the rate reduction? Do we do this quickly? Do we do this slowly? So here we took two events from the past, one relating to the States, the other one to Brazil. If you look at the States in 2020, when COVID erupted, markets were expecting much higher rates, and the Fed beat the market by bringing them down a lot faster than expected. Brazil did likewise in 2017 and also in 2000. Could they perhaps do this again? I would say that the interest rate decrease that actually took place is much less than what should be done now. So there's the issue of levels. But on the other hand, there's also the impact that a decrease in interest rates may have in terms of the capital flows, of inflation, and one issue that is not minor, and I will speak on a mirror basis. Let me show you what happened in the region when we raised the rates. When we did that, there was a significant exchange rate appreciation in the region, 12.5% for those that have inflation targets. But some countries like Colombia or Costa Rica or even Chile have had very high appreciation levels, some as high as 24, 25%. So the question we ask ourselves is, now that we are going to bring down the rate and will have a lower differential rate compared to the United States, instead of capital inflows, will we have outflows, depreciation, and therefore an impact on prices, which according to the pass-through levels in different economies may be more or less significant. So central banks, for now, have been gradually bringing down rates in most countries, which seems to be the right way to go until things clear up, and the United States helps us by bringing down its own interest rate. And very briefly, on the external front, the current account has also been performing its adjustment. We have gone from 9 to 1.6 on average, and the financial account has also played along by reducing financing for the time being without any sudden interruptions in financing. And since we talked about sudden stops, let me show you where the different determinants of sudden stops are that we have identified in the literature based on our work. And relative to other previous pre-crisis incidents, for example, 2007 before the 2008 crisis, or 2019 before the COVID crisis in 2020. When you look at the fiscal situation, we look worse off. When you look at the current account, same thing. With reserves, it's sort of halfway. We lost a bit by way of reserves, but not that much. And the only area in which we have improved is in dollarizing liabilities, which is also a factor that helps. And we look at on that front. But there's something to look at. In a world in which interest rates and monetary policy are changing a lot, we might end up being subject to these kinds of shocks. And so as to wrap up and give Arturo some time to talk about the long-term issues, let me say that we think the more gradual interest rate reduction policy is good. Financial systems should maintain their stability process, converging towards Basel III standards, and it should also be considered that we should avoid sudden stops. Fiscal positions need to be strengthened as well as reserves. So I'll give the floor to Arturo now for him to take over. Good. So I'll be very brief and talk about the long term so as to give time to our panelists. So, as the president said at the beginning, and as Eric said as well, our major problem as a region is that in the long term we grow very little. And what we can see on this slide is breakdowns of growth into the individual components and also for different parts of the world. Now, what we can see here is that in the LAC region generally, growth is not just lower than in the rest of the world, but also the main factor behind this is almost null productivity growth. We can see that the figure is truly low, and all of the work and much of the work that you will be reading in this chapter is the result of the work we have done that has obviously benefited from our contributors very much. And the countries that have really shown jumps in income levels is something we have found dividing countries into 4 income levels, and we see how they jump from one level to the next. And we see that in those countries that we see the jumps, there have also been greater productivity growth levels. That might have been modest, but still. So productivity is important, even more than the accumulation of factors. And the report contains an exercise that looks at what would have happened to the countries in Latin America if they'd had the accumulation of factors that certain Asian countries had, which grew quickly. And also, what if they had the productivity of those countries? And what we find, as reflected by the lines at the bottom, you can see the current levels and the factor accumulation. And the impacts are relatively low. At the end of the day, what really makes a difference, and a substantial difference over 3 times, sometimes in terms of the per capita GDP, it's about the productivity again. So whatever the diagnosis mechanism for the region's problems, the problem continues to be low productivity. And those problems become all the more conspicuous as countries climb up their income levels. And this is fleshed out in the report. You can see the factors that constrain growth or that limit jumping from one income level to the next. And what we can see here is that as we raise the income level, it becomes a lot more difficult to take that jump. So you may be in a certain income level. In order to jump to the next level, of course, the probability starts to become lower. When you get to the third income level, the possibility of jumping up to the next level is almost none. So that is a major issue. And there are many factors that explain this, one of them being the quality of human capital based on different measures. And we heard this in the introduction by Eric. The quality of human capital in the region is low, and that is something that we definitely need to do something about. And then there are the factors associated not just with work, with labor, but also with the way capital is allocated. And that is the sort of exercise that Eric referred to. We showed the productivity growth rate could even be doubled if we were to improve the way capital is allocated in the region. And then there's also the exercise that Eric also previewed regarding what the potential impact could be of improving competition in different markets, both in the product as well as labor markets, with a view to growing GDP and productivity. And again, these are figures that are significant, which basically makes us conclude that in order to work towards productivity growth and get past the 2% for the long term, which doesn't help us as a region, our agenda is quite extensive. And it is an agenda on which the IDB group can work closely hand in hand with the region's countries in order to help strengthen various areas. This list is not intended to be exhaustive, but there are different areas here which it is interesting to look at in detail in the work and studies to promote productivity growth opportunities. As the president also mentioned, considering the long term, it is important to think about the design of the tax regimes and systems. Some tax systems create incentives for business to remain small, which has an impact on productivity. A large business tends to be more productive than small business. We need to come up with ways to increase formalization, both as far as business and as far as labor is concerned, which means considering non-tax financing related funding mechanisms. Other things, you have payroll taxes, for example. There are significant issues to consider. Also issues related to competition, both domestically as well as externally. Also regional integration issues are associated with this. And also looking at ways to improve the credit markets in the region. Although they have grown in recent decades, they continue to be very low credit markets, exclusionary markets, which which make it difficult to help businesses grow from small and not very productive to large and more productive. And finally, of course, again, there's competition, something which we are working on in quite a bit of detail at the research department and other parts of the bank.
So, at the end of the day, the message that we wish to convey is that the region needs to do a lot of things to grow more in the long term, but it has already made very important efforts as far as consolidating or try to consolidate the institutions that support macroeconomic stability. And this stability is a fundamental pillar on which we need to build. And we have to do so thinking about ambitious reform agendas which will help us to go beyond the 2% of growth. Here you have the code so that you may download the report. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Alejandro y Arturo, for your presentations. Your presentations were very complete, but they are just the tip of the iceberg. We have 120 pages of analysis, so we invite you to read the report. A very interesting point is that we have more than 800 people connected through the social media. What we wish to do now is to have a panel. We always say we have luxurious guests, but today we do have luxurious guests. We have 3 economists. We have Ana Corbacho right here, who is the Deputy Director of the Western Hemisphere Department of the IMF. And I already see that we have Marcela Eslava, Professor and Dean of the University of Los Andes, and Liliana Rojas Suarez, Director of the Initiative for Latin America of the Center for Global Development. Welcome all. What we would like to do is to give 10 minutes to each of them to make comments or use it as a context. And then if we have time, we will have questions and answers. If we don't, then we will just finish with the ideas that they will present. Ana Corbacho will start first.
And I prepared all of my remarks in English. So rather than translating live for all of you, I'm going to let the professionals do the interpretation for those of you who want to follow in Spanish. So it's really great to be at the IDB. This was my home for a few years in my career, and I see so many friends in the audience. I almost feel like skipping everything and going straight to coffee. But I'm going to be a professional, and I'm going to offer some remarks on the report. Starting from the big picture, if you doze off after this, just take 2 messages. It's a great report. You should read it. Okay? So really congratulations to the editors and all the teams that I know are behind the great analysis. The report is very rich. It lays out what has happened to the region in terms of macro developments. It really goes deep into the long-lasting challenges of achieving stronger and more sustainable growth for Latin America and the Caribbean, and discusses the main fiscal, monetary, and financial sector policy issues. So it's really broad. To organize my comments, I want to deconstruct the title of the report. So first talk about macro stability, then discuss what it would take for the region to take off, and then I'm going to close with some more work that I hope the IDB could do for the rest of us so we can actually help the region grow faster and better. First, on macro stability, as we saw in the global economy, the region really showed a great deal of economic resilience. It bounced back quite quickly after COVID, after the pandemic. 2023 was a slowdown, but certainly much better than we all expected at the beginning of the year. And we now expect a relatively smooth convergence towards more sustainable levels of growth and lower inflation. This reflects several factors. Part has to do with the external environment, but I think a lot has to do with good macroeconomic management. So by and large, on policies, I think the region, I agree with Eric and Ilan, did a very good job, and as detailed in the report. So let me first talk about monetary policy. The report is right in recognizing that central banks in the region were very swift in their response to inflationary pressures. And some of them were among the first to raise monetary policy rates, and the strategy really has paid off. Inflation peaked earlier than in the rest of the world and is now declining across the board in most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is providing scope to cut interest rates ahead of other regions. Now, I would say that what lies ahead is probably the toughest part of the disinflationary phase. There was a big decline in commodity prices across the globe. This has certainly brought down headline numbers. And now the question is how fast will be the core disinflationary part take place. And the report flags a key risk that easing too rapidly could lead to changes in the interest rate differentials with the US. We would lose the benefits of the appreciation that happened through the hiking cycle, and this could be leading to capital outflows and risks of depreciation. So I will not say that this is not a challenge. I fully agree with that, but this is particularly for the inflation targeters in the region that have very well established frameworks and credible central banks, a relatively known challenge. And we've seen central banks gain credibility through time, and our expectation is that the exchange rate pass-through now is probably much lower than what we saw, 1 or 2 decades ago in the region. So for those inflation targeters, the challenge now is to actually see through that possible FX volatility, but stay the course in terms of achieving a sustainable decline of inflation towards target. But I think there are two more challenges on monetary policy where we know much less, and they're quite relevant in the current juncture. First, on monetary policy transmission. We all have been surprised about the fact that this disinflation phase has happened at relatively low cost to output. So this resilience, some people call it soft landing, maybe the Phillips curve has changed. We don't really know why this has happened. We would have expected much lower growth, negative output gaps to actually bring this disinflation episode. And this hasn't taken place. It has taken place in the context of a lot of economic resilience. So one possibility is that monetary policy transmission has changed post-COVID. Another possibility is that this had to do with the nature of the global shocks, and therefore, this mix of supply global shocks, demand shocks has changed the way inflation dynamics work in the region. Another possibility is that we have been too pessimistic on the amount of slack in this economy, and maybe potential output, even if not potential growth, maybe potential output has actually been higher than what we thought. And this is an unobservable, who knows, right? So this makes it very challenging, but it's also a very critical question to understand how fast interest rates can be cut in the period ahead and how effective monetary policy is. We will need more data and much more work to have some definitive answers on this. Second challenge is neutral rates. There is some growing consensus that neutral rates for monetary policy are higher now. And this has to do perhaps with fiscal uncertainty, the high levels of debt that we're observing. But is this increase temporary, or are we going back to pre-COVID times of very low neutral rates depressed by fundamentals, depressed by low levels of potential growth globally? This is quite critical because as the debate in the region is, how fast and where you're going, you sort of need to know what's your terminal rate. And there's quite a bit of uncertainty of what that terminal rate should be for monetary policy. And the chart on the US and Brazil, I think, is very telling because, in the US, we're still debating when the first cut is going to be. In Brazil, we're now debating when the last cut is going to be, and exactly where we're going to finish that easing cycle. So I think it's good to say that on monetary policy in the period ahead, caution seems to be the right approach. On fiscal policy, again, a lot of kudos go to policymakers in the region. There was a very good job in activating fiscal policy to provide support during the pandemic. And surprisingly, compared to other episodes, there was also a great effort to unwind that pandemic support, and primary surpluses have actually increased quite significantly in many of our countries. The overall balance remains a challenge. With high interest rates, of course, the interest bill has been higher than we thought, and the legacy of that is high public debt. So I think the region does have a high public debt challenge. We agree with the report that rebuilding this fiscal space is fundamental in the period ahead, and there's a really good set of policy recommendations in the report on how to go about improving that primary fiscal position. There's also a big agenda, of course, to be pursued in reducing that debt service cost through better medium-term debt strategies, deepening local capital markets, anchoring fiscal policy in credible paths so that the financing costs can also come down. The report makes a very strong pitch for good fiscal rules, and the emphasis is on good. It's very hard to disagree with that. I think it's also quite important, the emphasis on debt anchors, because we are now very far from where fiscal balances should have been according to the rules. So again, bringing that credibility of a medium-term consolidation path can be quite successful. But I'm going to challenge a little bit, perhaps it's just rhetoric in terms of what the report says on fiscal rules, more than substance, but I think the rhetoric is quite important. And I read the report as saying fiscal rules should protect public investment. I don't dispute the cyclical argument that in a fiscal consolidation, a rebalancing towards capital spending can be what we call more growth friendly. But I will also contend that there's lots of budget items that are very productive and should not be cut in principle. And I would talk about targeted social transfers of vulnerable households. Multipliers on those are very high, even if the consumption base is small. Spending on innovation and R&D, we think that that's one of the keys to boosting total factor productivity. Good spending on health and education is also fundamental. So I think in the design of fiscal rules, rather than talking about protecting any kind of spending, the critical challenge is how do we bring about cuts on the unproductive spending. And this is much easier said than done, but I worry about the rhetoric of protecting anything, because this in the region has led to rigidities in budgets, saying this spending cannot be touched, right? So floors, incentives, massive incentives for creative accounting. Suddenly everything is public investment, so nothing can be touched. And in the end, this mockery of how to go around the rules has ended up being policy slippages, and in the end, less fiscal discipline and higher public debt. Moving on to the last part of my comments on, are we ready to take off? I think my most preferred, my big fan of the chart on the takeoff. And this Asia, if we were to have total factor productivity growth as in Asia, that's the only one that really brings us to the sun, right? It's the yellow line with the takeoff. Are we ready? I think we're still far from being able to take on, to be on that plane. And there's a very big agenda of structural reforms that are necessary to boost total factor productivity in the region. And I fully agree with the need of a very comprehensive approach that looks at all those angles that can bring productivity, even for the same level of factors of production. At the same time, given this very long list of reforms, I think the very big question for policymakers is how to prioritize and sequence. And a concern is that in this productivity challenge, the challenge of political economy could be equally large. And that's where I also see some concerns in a very fragmented political landscape in the region is how are we going to bring that consensus needed to push for these big structural reforms. Let me close with some suggestions for future work related particularly to this takeoff agenda. One has to do with pandemic scarring. A key question, and this is open, is how the pandemic may have changed the productivity landscape. Some of the analysis we've done in the IMF shows that in downturns, historically, productivity has been hurt quite disproportionately. So we could conjecture that the pandemic was also a big hit to productivity. And this is quite important to understand to also design what are those priority reforms for the agenda that comes ahead. The second zooming is on gender dynamics. The region has a very big gender gap on labor force participation, on wages, and the pandemic hurt women disproportionately more. And some of the new evidence on the recent years seems to suggest that we now have fewer women, in fact, returning to the labor force. And we can't afford this. It's a gender agenda is important in itself, but in a context where demographics are going to detract dynamism to potential growth from lower labor supply, we can't afford to have women not working productively in the economy. Second topic is crime. We see this as of like first order importance for the region. Some of our early analysis shows that the very high crime rates in the region can affect capital accumulation and total factor productivity growth. Still very early to understand what the solutions are, but I think the IDB has a big comparative advantage, and I hope we can bring that macro aspect to the agenda quickly. Finally, on the green transition, to focus on something that, as Ilan said, the opportunities. I think future work also needs to focus on how the green transition can happen by bringing more productivity and skills to incentivize greener and better technologies. Thank you. I stop here.
Muchas gracias, Ana, por los comentarios ahí.
Thank you very much, Anna, for those comments. I have a whole long list now and lots of interesting things going forward. So I'll give the floor to Liliana Rojas Sares now. Thank you very much. I think you're muted. I don't think I am. Oh, perhaps in the room. Okay, so go ahead. Go ahead. Can you hear me? Yes, yes. We're good now. Super. Thank you very much, Eric. And I would like to echo the congratulations for Arturo, Alejandro, and all authors. It's a great document and a great comprehensive analysis of the problems faced by the region. I would like to make 3 comments that I think also supplement the report. I think the report rightly stresses the importance of monetary policy and of fiscal policy in the region. Many countries are being highly effective in curbing inflation and reversing the expansion of fiscal deficit which took place during the pandemic, which of course at the time was the right policy, what needed to be done. But at the same time, as the report shows, current and projected growth rates are extremely low, even in the absence of adverse scenarios. The fact remains that during the past decade, Latin America has presented the lowest growth among the world's emerging regions. The growth rate in the region in the past decade has been less than 2%, even if we exclude the pandemic period. That rate is lower than growth during the lost decade, as it came to be called. During that time, average growth was slightly above 2%. And as the report highlights, even if you look at the base scenario, the average growth rate forecast would only be 9%, and that would be obviously the base scenario without major shocks. So I see a major dichotomy between macroeconomic stability and growth, a divergence there. And I think the main reason for this is that most of the population and policymakers generally as well are well aware of the damage that high inflation levels do to economies and to social progress. History has been very clear in this regard, no need to repeat that. So generally, there is support for the growth in interest rates in order to lower inflation. The problem is that the consensus around this doesn't go any further, but for a few exceptions. Actually, conferences, executive councils haven't been able to implement the structural reforms that are truly needed for growth. So what has happened has been somewhat a bit of a vicious circle. No reforms, so there's little growth, limited social progress, which in turn plays a role in terms of social discontent, fanning political division, which, of course, ends up leading to a lack of consensus around reform, and there follows as well a lack of growth. So it's this vicious circle, and the scope of the vicious circle has continued to expand, as reflected by the tremendous political polarization in the region. And we know very well that the problem started before the pandemic, probably around 2015, following the boom in commodity prices, which brought high growth levels to the region. We know well that many of our countries are major commodities exporters. But when the boom was over and the external growth drivers cooled off, there were no internal engines to keep the process going. So the dynamism and growth slowed down considerably. The pandemic compounded already existing problems, especially in terms of the quality of democratic institutions, which is fundamental to growth. And this was not considered in great detail in the report, and I think that is very important. And also, in the absence of the needed reforms in the labor markets, well, there's this high level of dysfunctionality, which translates into exceedingly high informality levels among workers and businesses. In some countries, those levels reach as high as 70%. How can you build a country with sustainable growth if you have such high informality? Chile and Uruguay has informality levels below 30%. Those are the exceptions in the region. So informal sectors are much less productive than formal sectors, which obviously creates serious obstacles to growth. Now, the combination of these two things, informality and institutional weakness, interact with one another, as institutional fragility limits the delivery of high quality utility services and, very importantly, social guarantees, which reduces incentives for workers to participate in formal labor markets. So again, yet another vicious circle if you look at those variables. So in my opinion, understanding well the political economy of the region is key in order to break free from this stagnation, especially as the green transition, as we've all said, is creating a great real opportunity for the region. But that opportunity may risk not being fully harnessed unless we duly take into account these political economy elements that are essential. So there's still a lot of work to be done in this regard. And too much shorter comments. And on fiscal deficits, certainly the economic policy makers in many countries have been doing a very good job of reversing expansion that took place during the pandemic, which is essential to speed up the international capital markets, considering low spreads. And this applies to several countries in the region already. But the region has a serious challenge when it comes to mobilizing local resources, as the region has the lowest savings rate among emerging regions in the world, in addition to a very low ability to collect tax. So the tax revenue to GDP ratio is well below that in advanced countries. The gap is enormous compared to advanced countries. And this is at the heart of the problem because, of course, it is coupled with informality. So governments do need to spend more. They need to spend more on health, on education, infrastructure. They need to spend more, but of course, they're not able to do that. At the same time, they must maintain fiscal stability. They can't spend more and maintain fiscal stability and access capital markets, precisely because of the
lack of domestic resources. And this very severe restriction makes it difficult to envisage high rates of sustainable shared growth in the region. And finally, one last comment on growth in real credit, which obviously is also very closely linked to the behavior of GDP. Actually, this reflects the same symptom we've been discussing. The financial sector in the region is stable, just as independent central banks and effective monetary policies. Financial supervisors now have more powers, and the quality of supervision and regulation has improved a lot. As concluded in the report, in fact, there's a survey conducted by the IDB among several central banks and bank supervisors in the region. I was happy to take part in that project, but the report also highlights two matters of concern. First, credit, real credit in the private sector, though better than during the pandemic, is still low compared to the pre-pandemic period. And the second point, which has to do with the first one, is that the holding of government securities by banks has increased significantly compared to private sector credit. So governments are full of government paper. And although the financial markets are stable, they don't perceive the fact that there are a lot of high quality private projects. So the contribution to economic growth is also limited. So I don't think that there's a financial stability crisis, but these low levels of financial intimidation may be the true financial crisis the region suffers. So, in conclusion, the diagnosis for the region, the way I see it, is stable but compressed, much higher, much better than the situation we had in the 80s and 90s when the region was unstable and also compressed. But we are really still far behind the desirable result we all look forward to. I'll stop here. Thanks. Thank you so much, Liliana. I will highlight that takeaway. The diagnosis is stable, but there's work to do. And I now give you Marcela Eslava. Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Invitación, estoy muy honrada de estar aquí. Yo también los quiero felicitar por el reporte.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I wanted to congratulate you for the excellent report. I will make comments especially on what the report has not said about the importance of economic growth in general and the importance of the economic growth in particular. We have always been talking about this in general terms, so I would like to start pointing out that now we have to have a policy discussion in the region where the panorama is not well shared or understood by all. This is somehow related to the growing, unfortunately, growing prominence that it has in policy discussions. The concern due to lack of equality. But this concern, in a way, has pushed aside some ideas that are worrying, that the fight against inequality is somehow different from the fight for economic growth. Or what is even more worrisome is that these are on the opposite side of the discussion. Those both concepts are clear, and in some countries it is obvious that there may be an opposition between these two concepts, but in Latin America, we see that these two objectives must go hand in hand. Inequality in the region is due to very high levels of poverty and in order to eliminate poverty, we have to generate quality employment with good income. So my first comment is that I find this wonderful, but from now onwards, the authors will continue working on this report to help us in Latin America to think about better policies, taking into account the fact that this concept should be obvious to all public services, all voters, and all governments. The convergence of the priority of growth and equity makes us think and focus on some very few action points. The report focuses on a problem on human capital, and there is also obstacles to a good allocation of resources. And these elements are considered as responsible for the low growth rate in the region. The report also very well points out, as Liliana said, that if I think about where are the greatest obstacles to a more efficient allocation and improving human capital that are related to the poor productivity in the region, this element is clear. We have less productive workers, less productive activities, and the workers are poorer and are less protected. And this is a source of inequality. When we think about public policy, the report points out some very interesting points which are based on the border analysis that we economists have done. So they are talking about the formalization, the enforcements that is also so difficult to translate, and to mitigate negative incentives through taxes, which sometimes create problems for corporations. These elements are very well identified in literature, but I would like to add to this that somehow I believe that these focus is limited because you're thinking about corporations that already exist and have the capacity to meet these regulations. And those corporations, without a doubt, exist, and we can leverage them for growth. But that is not the segment of productive activities where we have a greater deficit of productivity, nor where we have the poorest workers, nor where we have more informality. And this might be the fundamental complement which I would like to bring to the discussion when the authors continue studying elements of this report and think about the situation in Latin America. They should try to focus more in the productive cycle in Latin America. Almost all of us who work on productivity usually forget this because in our analysis we're using corporation data. Those gigantic productivity deficits are concentrated in labor and productivity sources which are not included in the corporation data, and it is very difficult to include them and therefore to take into account what is going on. More than 30% of workers in Latin America are working independently. So when there are many small enterprises, we should think that we have many micro enterprises and individuals that are constituted as corporations. So I think that a fundamental question is why do we have this productive sector? Why is it created in this way? Which are the social incentives? We have some regulations which are destined to protect workers, but somehow there is a very small fraction of workers that are included, and they become a very important obstacle to us getting organized to be more productive and to have more social protection. Why are these barriers so expensive when they aren't in other parts of the world? Precisely because of the low level of productivity, they're not attainable by many workers, especially if we add the minimum salary and social security and other taxes. When we add all these things up, this is way above uh, the income that most workers can expect to attain. So we have to make public policy decisions which should include something that is absolutely important, which is the growth of the human capital. If what we have is a gap between the costs and the regulations, the gap should be closed by improving the productivity levels, but we should focus on having better and more quality human capital. And the focus should be in the more vulnerable sectors of the population. But the gap should also be closed by rationalizing the costs that are required. And these costs come from the need to protect the workers. So the question is, how are we going to finance this in a different way? So this is the fundamental element which I wanted to comment with regard to what the report already states. I didn't mention competitions, and other elements that are included in the report which are very important. In no way would I want to give you the impression that they're not important, but I do believe that for the time being, in view of the political situation in the region and with the need to increase productivity and on how difficult this was in the past when there was not so much political tension, we are at a point in time when it is of special importance to focus a lot, have very few priorities, and those priorities should not be so general. They should be more specific for production and for the segment of the productive machinery. Thank you. We are out of time. I would like to thank the members of our panelists, Ana, Liliana, and Marcela. They're friends of this house. They have given us good recommendations, which we'll take into account in our diagnosis and in our narrative. So once again, thank you so much for you. We also wish to thank all of the persons that have connected to this Zoom, not only in Teams, but in YouTube and LinkedIn. Thank you very much, because we had 800 people connected to this call, so it is a success. It shows that Latin America and the Caribbean is very interested in our analysis. And thank you, those present in the room. I know that we have many questions, and the more you know, the more questions you have. But this year we have an innovation. When you go to the webpage of the 2024 report, you will find an IA app, and you will be able to ask any question about the report, and artificial intelligence is going to replace editors and will reply, indicating you which is the exact reference that is related to the questions you have asked. So I invite you all to test this out, to interact with our report. And once again, thank you so much to everybody, the panelists, the editors, and I shall see you next time around. Thank you so much.